Okay, so I recently finished Dread X Collection 2. Overall, I would say it's an improvement over 1. I'm going to get through these as quick as I can because I don't know how much time I have, and I'll try to elaborate on how much I like them. I decided to keep in the tier list placings for the first part, just for people to be able to compare and contrast what I have set right now. Um, uh, for those who haven't seen the first video, A is highest available tier. I'm not going any higher over that, just because I don't want it to get clogged down with more postings. A, to me, is great or um, near perfect. It doesn't necessarily have to be near perfect, but it could be depending on the circumstances, or at the very least great. May have a lot of flaws and issues, but still great. B is very good. C is good. D is either a 50-50 split where half of me loves it, half of me doesn't love it, mediocre, or below average for me personally. And F is bad. This is just a personal ranking. Most of this is just going to be subjective based on how I feel about these. And to start things off, may as well get through it. I'm going to go through alphabetical. Another Late Night. This one is about, and I'll give little plot descriptions without going into too much spoilers. This one is about a person who is surfing the internet who is being accosted or, I guess, stalked through their PC by a mysterious force or people or person that is asking them a lot of very personal questions, and you basically answer questions and then browse around on the PC in order to get a better understanding of what type of character you're playing as. And while I love the music, I love the visual design, I love how um, bluntly honest a lot of aspects of it are in terms of the writing and in terms of how it portrays a typical day on the internet with the browsing and the chat rooms and everything, I'm going to have to go ahead and put this one in the solid F. Um, I prefer it, I may as well reorganize this a little bit. I prefer it over, actually, let me reorganize this slightly. Let me make sure Outsiders, Pony Factory, Hand of Doom, Mr. Bucket. I'm actually going to put the Pay is Nice over Carthank, because Carthank was a lot more frustrating than the Pay is Nice. I was disappointed by the Pay is Nice, but that was still an interesting experience. I would put this above Rotgut, but it's my least favorite of this second collection for a few reasons. One of which being the central idea behind this collection was the concept of love crafting, where the general idea was to make a Lovecraftian style game, or inspired by cosmic horror. And personally, I don't really think this game, from what I could understand of the story, really captured that at all. This just feels like something or anything that could just happen under certain circumstances in the real world, and there is a certain level of creepiness to that. But in terms of trying to capture what the general thesis for the collection was, I feel like this one just didn't click. And on top of that, there are a lot of aspects to the story throughout that, much like, say, the Pay is Nice, really feel like they should be expanded upon, or in some cases just feel as though they might have relevance to the overall collection or what's going on in the story of the overall collection, which I'll get to. Um, but they feel, some aspects of this game feel very disjointed. You know, you play through it, it's building up to something, and then that something that it builds up to isn't really anything cosmic horror related, at least as far as I could tell. And then on top of that, it just kind of ends. Like, you're sort of left there to, left to your own devices to still mess around on the PC, but past that point, the only other thing you can do is really just close out. I mean, like, the chat room never really fills out anymore. You can't even link to, like, the link to the Doom Trooper game, which is actually like a built-in URL that you can go to, doesn't even work. I'm not sure if it used to work and it doesn't now, so parts of the experience may not even be functioning as they used to be. Although one of the news articles related to that mentions how the game was taken down, so maybe that adds to the whole meta-narrative of it. It's very much a personal thing, because really, The game itself and the story it tells is intriguing enough, but the overall gameplay experience and the story experience for what this pack was going for or what I was anticipating, it just didn't satisfy me. Um, I can appreciate the craftsmanship on display for what they were trying to go for, though. I just personally didn't like it. I felt like by the end of it, I was like, that's it. Same with Rotgut, but at least this one's more functional and a lot less. I don't know what Rotgut was going for. Rotgut just kind of felt like a punch to the gut as opposed to a game you played. Um, so yeah. Next up for alphabetical, Arcadeltra. This is a game made by an indie developer that I need to look more into called Vitus Games that has a lot of smaller games on itch.io. This is about a person who is trapped, and I have to emphasize trapped because I personally do think that the character is trapped or willingly went to this arcade, and he is being beckoned by a woman to help save him. To help save her. And you have to hook up these arcade games or these arcade cabinets to a present that leads into this bottomless pit, and you have to interact with the arcade and interact and move around the arcade. And the further and further you get in, the closer and closer you get to saving this person. And that's all I'll say past this point, because while I have problems with this one, I'm going to go ahead and say this is a B. This one, the only real major issue besides the interactivity being very minimal, which, although that's not that big of an issue, and some performance problems, and on top of that being a little too reliant on jump scares, I thought this one was very well written, with a really solid payoff, with multiple endings as well, without going into it. Not too many, but, a few, you know, a few endings. And the atmosphere and the tension and the, unlike, say, Another Late Night, which feels like its own thing that just happens to be bundled in with this Lovecraftian cosmic horror concept, Arcadeltra very much encapsulates the concepts of cosmic horror or horror beyond um, comprehension or horror beyond your control that is actively influencing you to do things against your will, pushing you forward. Arcadeltra gets that. It gets that while also telling a really gothically twisted, I guess the best way I can describe it is first date story, without going too much into detail. It's interesting. It's interesting. There are a lot of, and while the game does rely way too much on standard scare setups with some jump scares, some of those jump scares on a few occasions are truly out of nowhere, shocking, and really effective. And then on top of that, the overall experience is very uncomfortable. Like, mostly because the audio design, more so than the visual design, is really excellent. So you really feel like, in terms of the audio alone, that you're trapped in this arcade and you really don't want to push forward. You don't want to push forward, but you have no other choice to, unless you quit out of the game. And this game does a really good job of capturing that and capturing that feeling of being trapped and feeling like you're making progress, but in reality, it's all a part of the design. I really liked it. I don't think it's great, and personally, I think it's way too reliant on jump scares compared to, say, even the likes of Summer Night or Don't Go Out, or the Pony Factory, which had more complex mechanics, on top of having less of a focus or emphasis on jump. Well, the Pony Factory had some jump scares. Summer Night had a few, but for the most part, they're also much more mechanically in-depth. Whereas this one's a lot more just walk to the location, interact with things, progress. So there's not. It's very much a minimalist game in that respect. But I'm not gonna lie, the overall effect. This usually wouldn't be the type of game that I would like as much as others, but the overall effect that it had was surprisingly good. So I'm definitely putting that in the B tier. I gotta look over my listings real quick. Oh yeah, here we go. Where is it? I have my scores on a little scorecard, but I kind of want to leave the suspense. Hold on, let me make sure. Yep, okay. OBS doesn't have any issues with that. Where is it? Charlotte's Exile. I am putting this in the solid. It's not my favorite of the A tier. That would still go to Outsiders and Shatter, but it's close. This is an A tier game. This is from John, I think it's Szymanski, or Szymanski? I'm going to say Szymanski. John Szymanski, who, if I remember correctly, is the brother or the relative of David Szymanski, of Dusk and Pony Factory and Iron Lung recently fame. He's also working, John Szymanski is also working on a game I'm really looking forward to that I played quite extensively for the demo called My Friendly Neighborhood, which is sort of like a Sesame Street survival horror shooter game. Can't wait for that one. But he made a game for this collection called Charlotte's Exile. Basically, your wife has gone missing. You go to this library to try to find her or save her. And it's basically you have to go through a book. It's a puzzle game, really. It's a puzzle game mixed with or inspired partially by Five Nights at Freddy's, where you have to go through a book detailing Cthulhu-inspired mythos while a mysterious figure is trying to get edge closer and closer and closer to you as you begin to decipher and translate this novel while solving some puzzles around the table. But this entity will attempt to stop you or disrupt you, so you have to keep your eyes on it at all times. This one, for me personally, was nerve-wracking. This one was hard to get through, partially because the puzzle design elements are actually pretty clever, and on top of that, there's no mood music for this one, like say Shatter and Outsiders. So anything that happens, and you don't. There's no cue. There's no cue to tell you or to expect you when to be scared with the hopes that you'll be scared. This one will just sneak up on you in terms of the scares and in terms of the tension. It's all just natural audio sounds of you being in this library and having to keep an eye on this thing that makes pretty much no noise unless it gets closer. If it gets too close and you spot it and it runs off, then it'll make like a jump scare noise, which is a little unfortunate. It does very much have jump scare moments, but honestly, the overall game design, alongside the fact that much like Arcadeltra, this one has multiple endings, the overall design is brilliant enough while being true to form with its exploration of Cthulhu and Lovecraftian and cosmic horror mythos. It's so on point. It is so on point, especially with the entire mechanics of having to solve a puzzle in order to progress the plot. And those puzzles that you solve may or may not have unintended consequences for you in your quest to get back your wife. And it's just a really good story, really solid, really good, simple story that gets its point across really well, while at the same time really getting the intrigue of the Cthulhu mythos, or Cthulhu mythos. And on top of that, it's probably the most modular of the bunch in terms of how you can complete it. Because if you know what you're doing, you can speedrun this in seconds. And then on top of that, there are, you can speedrun through the book. If you know how to do the combination lock on a box, you can get through that really quick without going into too many details. There's a lot of different ways that you can sort of, if you want to do a replay, that you can basically apply yourself in whatever way you want to try to get through it as quickly as possible on a second or third run through. So the actual design elements are just exquisite. This is easily one of the best in this pack and one of the best across both packs. Definitely worth a playthrough. Let me see. There's a lot of thes in terms of the title, so I'll just go based off of the next word for whichever. Let me double check. Oh yeah. So this next one is probably my personal favorite of this collection specifically. Let me see. Yeah, there's a lot mixed in here. Yeah. I debate whether I don't like it more than Shatter, and I probably don't like it as much as Outsiders, but the Diving Bell is the best game in this collection. by far as I'm concerned. This is a psychological horror game about a man who is under the sea at a research lab underwater, who has to go about his daily tasks while living with the guilt of an action he did, while something may or may not be trying to get inside. This is pure, unadulterated tension. Just, just pure tension. You never really know as you are playing this how safe you are. The mechanics are very simple. It's very minimalist. All you do is basically just make sure you don't look towards things that may trouble your character or cause their heart rate to spike, while at the same time taking anti-anxiety pills to offset that. But the writing and the overall game design is brilliant in that you never really know how safe you are, and I love how it ends. It was so creepy. It really bothered me um, in terms of how everything wraps up. And I love how, because a lot of games in these collections have this problem where, how do I put this? There's always to a certain extent with horror where you can very clearly tell in terms of how things are playing out sometimes where things will be going, and that's true for this one, but usually you can offset the tension of what may or may not happen to you, whereas with this one, this is true pure psychological horror because you never know how safe you are, and this game is smart in that it drags sections like that out for long periods of time where you're positive, you're almost certain that something is going to jump out at you. There's going to be some jump scare, or something's going to jump out or actually get through and attack you. But there's long stretches where just nothing actually happens. Or you'll hear something for the first time and you'll think that it's something, but it's actually, like if you enter a room for the first time, you'll think you're about to hear a monster because it's so dark, but it's actually just the whirring of engines. So the audio design mixed with the tension building mixed with the writing, it's just exquisite. It understands that real horror is more so the anticipation of something scary happening to you, even if you're never in danger of anything happening sometimes. And that is brilliant. Like, this game absolutely nails the Lovecraftian aspect. It nails the psychological horror aspects. It nails the minimalist gameplay aspects. And it just messes with you the entire way through. The whole way through, it's constantly messing with you in ways that no other game really in either of these collections, besides one metagame, which I'll get to in a minute, can really accomplish besides this one. So for me, oh, hold on. Okay. For me, this is easily the best game of the collection, by far. No question. I loved the Diving Bell. Next up, let me see. Yeah. Okay. This is a follow-up and technically a prequel to the events of Carthang from the same developer, Scythe Dev Team, who I also recently found out worked on Happy's Humble Burger Barn, which is like a free prequel demo to Happy's Humble Burger, Burger Barn to Happy's Humble Burger Farm. So they're very much expanding out into a full release now, which is cool to see because To the End of Days is a C. It's an improvement over Carthank, I think. While not as ambitious as Carthank, and it plays it a lot safer, I think the overall execution is a lot better. This is basically about a planet who is about to be hit by a comet. It's a first-person shooter, and you basically just have to survive. It's just go by level and survive. Much like Carthank, great soundtrack, great visual design, great aesthetics, really solid sense of tension in terms of going from room to room, not really sure, what's going to be around the next corner, having to prepare ahead of time. And this one is just fun. It's just fun. And I love the reveal that it's tied to Carthank without going into too much. Though, to what extent is left kind of up to interpretation. But basically, there's a lot more going on than just a comet's going to hit you. Um, However, as much as I did enjoy this one, I will say that I think I prefer Hand of Doom and Mr. Bucket Told Me to more, simply because, much like Carthank, this one comes with its own frustrations. You have to manage ammo and health, um, and as you're going through, the one thing I will say is for the combat, this game is brutally straightforward in that enemies can take a while to kill you, but you can kill enemies pretty much in one shot, and it's very satisfying to take down some of these enemies. And I like how each area you go to, they change up enemy compositions a little bit, and some have some side objectives here and there, like for the first level. But once it gets to some of the heavier hitting enemies, it gets a little frustrating. There are some enemies in this game that are, there's not that many, but some of the enemies in this game are bullet sponges, and they are frustratingly fast bullet sponges who will just rush you. And if you get stuck on anything, you're basically dead, and then you have to restart the entire level over again, which isn't a deal breaker because the levels are short, but it is rather frustrating without checkpoints with some of these enemies. It doesn't help that you can kind of break enemy path, much like the Pony Factory, you can kind of break enemy pathfinding, so it makes it way too easy. And on top of that, on a few occasions, and on top of that, the sometimes the range at which your guns seem to do damage or get enemies' attention for them to run towards you to then deal more damage is just, it's wildly annoying, because you'll see some of these heavier hitting enemies from a distance. You'll want to shoot them ahead of time before they start rushing at you to get some damage off on them, but you can't really tell how much damage you're doing to them because they're bullet sponges who only have a death animation after a few hits, and it's sometimes you don't even get their attention. Like, they're right there, right down the hole, so to speak, and you can't even get their attention. They just won't respond until you run up to them within a certain range, then they'll run at you. And then all you have to do is hop up onto higher planes, and they just kind of look at you. They don't know what to do. And on top of that, some of the audio aspects were somewhat annoying. You play as a main character who actually has his own voice and personality in this, and he tends to repeat the same phrases over and over again, and the audio quality is a little too beefy and crunchy for his audio recordings, so it can be kind of grating on the ears. And I felt like near the end the story felt a little rushed, but otherwise, this was a pretty fun time. This was a pretty fun time, and I recently streamed Happy's Humble Burger Barn, and I can say that this is a development studio, Scythe dev team, that is progressively getting better and better with every release. Because Carthank was promising, and I wanted to like it, but I just couldn't. It was too frustrating. To the End of Days is frustrating, but overall better executed. It's not as frustrating to the point where it ruins the experience, and it ends up being a really fun time. And then Happy's Humble Burger Barn, while being more minimalist and not having as many mechanics as Carthank and To the End of Days, is a much better executed experience. So it's very clear that they're just improving from game to game to game, which was nice to see. I will definitely be looking forward to whatever they make, and it's definitely getting a C tier from me. Let me double check. My listings are somewhat out of order. I apologize for this. End of Days, timing. Yep. So, I mentioned a metagame earlier, and I mentioned how the only game that is similar to the Diving Bell would be the metagame in terms of how it builds tension, and that would be the metagame experience overall for the collection, which I refer to as a game in and of itself. I just call it the Mansion. When you are playing, unlike DreadX, which I'm giving an A, when you are playing DreadX Collection 2, unlike 1, which was just a menu selection with a surprise at the end, DreadX Collection 2 has a game in and of itself that, in order to play the other games in the collection, which are a reward, you have to play through it. It's a story about someone suffering from a cognitovirus who has been imprisoned by someone else. And the whole idea for this collection of games is that you're being given a cognitive kick to sort of scare you back to your senses. And you have to go around this mansion solving puzzles in order to get keys to unlock the VHS tapes to play these playable little games. And honestly, I really loved this. I really loved this metagame experience that they built for this game. It was built by and partially constructed by the person who made my favorite game of all of these collections so far, Shatter, and who is also working on Dread Delusion. Um, I loved the aesthetics. It controls really well. It's creepy and in a way that, much like the Diving Bell, really plays on um, psychological fears in terms of you're never really sure how safe you are as you're moving through this mansion. It's very similar to Resident Evil in that it has puzzles that you solve throughout that helps you get to get the rewards that you need, that are sometimes way too simple, but other times are actually surprisingly well thought out. Um, and on top of that, as you're going through this, you're also collecting comic book pages that are telling their own little side story to boot. And I love the way it builds up, and I especially love the ending. The ending reveal um, was great. I loved it. I love how the entire collection ends compared to the first collection. And I love how the whole experience is interactive. And I don't want to get too much into it, just due to fear of spoilers, but it's intriguing. And it adds more questions than answers, but at the same time, it's a good enough reveal to where it makes me even more excited now to play Dread X Collection 3 to see if these all keep tying into each other. That's a solid A from me. I really enjoyed the Mansion metagame and the story it told in it. Let me see. Okay, so next one up is Solipsis. This is from the developer of Pony Island, which I played and is a very good, solid game. Solid game that messes with your perception of how you think it's going to play out. The Hex, which I haven't played yet, and recently what the developer is most known for is the card horror game Inscription, which I've been avoiding due to spoilers. Solipsis, I would say, is easily the better than Arcadeltra, but that's mostly due, and it's definitely a B, mostly due to the mechanics. You play as an astronaut going to the moon, and weird things happen, and that's all I'll say in regards to it. This one also does a really good job at capturing the Lovecraftian horror elements in terms of that sense of dread and not being able to escape a horrific fate that has been predetermined for you by powers outside of your control. And I love the rationalization mechanic. This game has a very awesome stylistic mechanic involving trying to rationalize what's happening to you, so it will zoom down to the player level, and you have to sort of mentally process the insanity that is occurring, and as you go further and further and further, it just gets, the tension just builds and builds and builds. I love this one. The only problem is that I honestly feel like the mechanics for this should be fleshed out more into um, a larger experience, because I honestly felt like it was for such a great mechanic, it was too short. It's way too short. It is easily the shortest game in this entire collection, without question. You can beat this thing in less than 20 minutes, but at the same time, it's one of the best experiences out of the collection. And I kind of wish, unlike, say, from the first collection, Summer Night, or the other game that I prefer, Solipsis over Arcadeltra, which is longer. This one really feels like it could do with an expansion into a larger game, but it just doesn't get that. Like, it tells a really good short little story with a proper beginning, middle, and end, but at the same time, well, that and also some of the navigation for the areas takes a little too long, which kind of makes sense. You're on the moon, so it'll be a little slow. But at the same time, some of the navigation can be in terms of like whether you can walk over certain sections like rocks and stuff because you'll just hit them and stop. Can be a little annoying. But overall, this is just a B because I wanted more and I just didn't get it. But it's otherwise a really solid, smaller experience. And speaking of solid, smaller experiences, Sucker for Love. This is this was expanded into a much larger title. Honestly, not into these types of simulation games, but it's a part of the collection, so I decided to play it, and I gotta say, this was way better. Way better than I was expecting to be, and it had better writing than I was expecting as well. This is a visual novel game where you play as a cultist trying to get a date. And anything past that point I'm not going to spoil. This one has multiple endings, really clever mechanics, and really solid writing. Solidly funny, and also actually really solid horror writing as well. Great visual design, very good music, really good voice acting. This was a surprise for me. I was really shocked at how good this actually was. And I'm honestly contemplating and how it subverts the expectations for how this genre tends to play out, and focuses less on the dating simulation aspects and more so on the horror aspects, and ties that into the dark comedy. And on top of that, there is a specific quote or line of dialogue from this game specifically that does a really like that I've just been thinking about ever since, and it's in one of the endings, and it really sums up Lovecraftian horror in a brilliantly funny and bleak way that I've never seen anyone really summarize as succinctly. It's actually like there are elements of the game's writing that are brilliant. That are actually really like very well put in regards to Lovecraftian horror, and like the only reason why this is a B, quite frankly, is honestly because I know that this is a much larger experience now. This is a part of a much larger game. It feels very much like it could be expanded upon, and thankfully was. But yeah, this is a solid B. This was a major surprise for me. I was not really looking forward to playing this, and it ended up being a lot funnier and a lot more interesting than it had any right to be, with a lot more mechanical depth too. So yeah, let me see. Yep, and David Szymanski strikes again. Squirrel Stapler. Squirrel Stapler is easily, I would say, is it better than Pony Factory? It's a B. Is it better than Pony Factory? I think it's better than Don't Go Out because it feels like a more fleshed out experience. It might be better than Pony Factory. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say it. It's better than Pony Factory. Well, yeah. Yeah, no, it's better than Pony Factory. Squirrel Stapler, I'm contemplating possibly moving it up to an A. This is another example of David Szymanski's control and really good understanding of horror. This is about a man who I presume murdered his wife and then wishes to reconstruct her with squirrels that he hunts. It is a hunting parody game. Yeah. This one is... How do I best describe this one? I may as well just go through the basics. Solid movement mechanics, really solid sound, like excellent sound design. Pitch perfect sound design in terms of how, and it ties into the mechanics too, since this is a hunting game where you have to move through areas. You make sound, enemies around you make certain levels of sound based on distances, so you have to gauge or gauge how far an enemy is or how far how far a squirrel is in the distance that you'll be hunting. It takes place over the course of 5 days. As those days progress, things get a lot more dangerous for you as the hunter, and a lot more foreboding. Um, I really like this one, and it's easily one of the funniest at first in terms of its dark humor, but also one of in the long run one of the scariest in any of these collections, and quite frankly probably one of the most tension-inducing like horror games I've played. Easily, like a lot of these games are honestly, but this one in particular, it helps that the mechanics do a really good job at a sense of build-up, because a lot of the times you'll be moving around as if this were a hunting game, so you're never really sure where your targets are until you sneak up on them or they start to sneak up on you. And so you have to be very careful. You have to be careful about your resource management, because this is very much a first-person survival horror hunting game where there are ammo caches and health caches in case you need to heal. There are notes that tie into the central narrative as you progress through the days that thematically tie into the central narrative of what's going on. There are mysterious locations around that you can explore that might hide their own secrets. I'm not really sure what they could possibly entail, because some of them can damage you. And the ending, man, the ending is probably some of the largest amount of build-up and fear I've ever had playing any video game or any work of horror fiction. The ending is so brilliantly constructed. And on top of that, what really helps is that throughout this experience, with the exception of a few musical cues, the opening menu and the ending, there's no music. This very much plays up the idea of it being a hunting parody, in that you have to move through these locations. There's no music to sort of guide you in terms of what type of mental state you should be in while playing it. It builds fear naturally through you having to move through the brush and hunt. And enemies won't necessarily be in the same place all the time, so you have to move through these areas cautiously in order to hunt your game and track your targets. And it's not as in-depth as some other hunting games. I think this... and on top of that, it can be a little frustrating and time-consuming to look for targets, especially near the later portions of the game when you start to get hunted. It can get a little frustrating, and there are a few, jump scares. I prefer horror that doesn't rely on jump scares. There are a few jump scares in here. I would have preferred not being jump scared, although, to be fair, the two jump scares that are in here in particular are still solid, all things considered. This game doesn't overstay its welcome in that regard. But the only other elements I don't particularly care for are that there are some enemies that are very prone to seeing you before you see them, and it can be a little frustrating while you're trying to deal with and tackle other enemies, because you can get double teamed and just have your whole day ruined. On top of that, some enemies, and I think it's cleverly designed to a certain extent, but some enemies I think are programmed to not see you within certain parameters, which under any normal circumstances they should really be able to see you and spot you. So once you kind of figure out how to game the system, it can be a little too easy. So that's part of the reason why I put this in the B category, but it's still top of the B category. It's darkly humorous, well written, and on top of that, on numerous occasions, nail-bitingly tense, and by the end of it, utterly terrifying. And it's one of those things where, as I contemplate it more and more, I wonder if I want to push it up to A, because this one very much doesn't really need any other expansion or explanation. This is a proper beginning, middle, and end. It does not need a follow-up. It does not need expansion. It's a game in and of itself. It took me about 2.5, 3 hours to beat it, so it does not need to be expanded upon. It gets the job done in the time allotted just fine. So yeah, top of the B tier. And David Szymanski, is a brilliant, horrifying developer, and I swear I'll get to Dusk. I swear I'm gonna get to Dusk eventually. I'll do a full live stream of it just to finish off my Mind of Horrors playlist. I feel like I owe it to him at this point. Let me see. Oh, yeah. Okay. Where is it? Where is it on this? Yep. The Thing in the Lake. Okay. I was really looking forward to this one because this is being developed by a developer for a game called World of Horrors, which I still need to play, but I'm very much looking forward to. And that game is sort of a turn-based Junji Ito-inspired horror game where you have to investigate and solve mysteries in a town that is being corrupted by cosmic horrors. And that one's still in early access, and I can't wait to play it. This is from the same developer. This is about a location in Poland that is being, I guess, set up for a ritual. And it's a chapter-based game where you play as several characters whose stories all interlink to form a larger narrative. And it's very much old-school inspired in terms of its design, retro-inspired. It plays in the equivalent visually, audio-wise, and gameplay-wise like something you would play out of like maybe a game in the late 80s, early 90s on a PC. And unfortunately, I am putting this in the D tier. If I'm being perfectly frank, maybe top of the D tier, I'm not sure. I didn't like it. Mostly due to the frustration of the mechanics. And honestly, I don't even know if I cared for the story that much either. Okay, I'm thinking about possibly putting this in the C tier. I'm rethinking it. I like the exploration elements. I like how you can find notes that, flesh out the world. I like how you play multiple characters all connected to a larger narrative. That's great. I love those elements. I really like the game is tense. It does build tension really well. And it has multiple endings on top of that. So it has some replay value in terms of how you proceed with things. And on top of that, it has a really solid visual design that helps add to the tension. Great visual design, pretty solid sound design, and good music. But man, it wasn't fun to play. And it mostly boils down to the controls and the design in terms of how easily it is to fail at this. Because this is very much a chaser horror game where enemies run after you and you have to run away because you can't fight back. But the controls were a pain, an absolute pain to deal with. You basically move around with WASD, but you run with shift, and you have a stamina meter. And the crux of it is that there are enemies that will, under certain circumstances and triggers, and sometimes randomly, will just come out of nowhere and chase you. And you have to dodge obstacles to get around them, and it's frustrating. It's very frustrating, and I just didn't enjoy it. In any other circumstance, this wouldn't bother me, because I've played other games like this, and I've enjoyed them, but for this one, like even something like Alien Isolation, where that's more of a survival horror game, but when you're running from the alien or trying to get around the alien, it's a one-hit kill, you have to get away. But it's mostly just the execution, because a lot of times, you can't really, with the exception of one enemy type which you can predict, you can't really predict when you're going to get hit by a certain enemy type. So sometimes you'll enter an area, you'll be exploring and investigating, and it will take a while for the enemy to show up and start chasing you. And it is very fast, so you have to move. No matter what, it will catch up to you if you're not careful. But the problem is that it's semi-randomized. So sometimes you'll enter an area, there will be traps in a certain area that you have to avoid, and then the chaser comes after you as well. And the chaser will pretty much always catch up with you unless you dodge around obstacles, and even then it gradually picks up speed as it's chasing you. So you'll just die anyway, and then you have to restart the entire chapter from scratch if you die. There are no checkpoints. There's no saving. you restart the entire chapter. This is, even if you play it on easy mode with extra stamina, the act of having to reach over and use the shift key while running and dodging some of these obstacles, and sometimes it's because of the visual design. Honestly, I liked it for the most part, but sometimes it's hard to tell what is or is not an obstacle you have to move around. So sometimes you'll just end up stuck in areas, and you're basically screwed. You can't do anything about it. You are screwed, and you're pretty much guaranteed to restart the chapter. And the build-up for the storytelling and the mystery was interesting, but quite frankly, the payoff for me... Well, okay, the payoff for the other endings is fine. One of the endings felt too abrupt, and I don't know, like, I don't think, in terms of, once you figure out how everything is playing out, I personally just don't think one of the endings in particular makes any sense. Like, it just doesn't, maybe I just wasn't paying attention enough, but it just didn't make sense to me. It just felt like, it felt inconsistent with some of the lore and the story, the background story details that were set up ahead of time. So it just kind of, and on top of that, it just abruptly ends, and it just felt, it felt, I don't know, it just felt unsatisfying. So even story elements just aren't satisfying in the long run for this one. I really wanted to enjoy this one, and I'm willing to admit that this is more so a personal gripe with the game, because the game it's not super buggy, it doesn't have like major graphical glitches or problems, it's not prone to breaking. I just didn't have, I wanted to be excited and on the edge of my toes playing, but I ended up just being frustrated by the mechanics and the story in the long run. I was pretty disappointed in it. To be fair, upon introspection and looking back on it, I might upgrade it to C tier. Maybe, but honestly, at the moment, it's a D tier title. This is the one game I wanted to like more than any of the other ones that I have not enjoyed thus far. There will be one more that I'll mention soon that I'll get to in a bit. This is the one that I was really looking forward to that really let me down, just subjectively speaking. I was let down by the most out of all of them. But I'm at the very least, I'm still looking forward to playing World of Horror, and I know the developer is talented and a solid developer. This is just mostly like a personal gripe with me. I just didn't enjoy the experience. And to top off the tease, though, moving on, finally, the Toy Shop. This is from the same developer as, I found out I think this is a singular developer or a team that worked on an SCP game. And they also developed the Outsiders from the first Red X collection. This is about a person you play as, referred to as a toy soldier, who is moving through areas trying to sort of solve a mystery about what's going on while being looked upon by a being known as the Shopkeeper, which is like a larger-than-life person. As you move around with these other humans, that like you move through these areas and you come across these other humans who are roughly the same size as you, and I don't want to spoil this one. This one is definitely, I would say, maybe not. It's not as good as Outsiders. And I would say Squirrel Stapler overall had the better execution gameplay-wise. But it's easily, I mean, this is one of those ones, much like Squirrel Stapler, where I'm contemplating moving it up to A. Because this, again, proves that this developer is on a roll, and I'm really hoping this one gets expanded upon into a sequel or a fuller title. This game is a mix between genres. On the one hand, it's much like The Thing in the Lake. It's a first-person run-from-the-enemy game where enemies can one-hit kill you. And in my opinion, despite some frustrating sections, especially near the end, it actually handles that better than The Thing in the Lake. 1 minute it's one genre, the next minute it's a platformer, the next minute it's a first-person survival horror action shooter. It has a lot going on mechanics-wise, and some of those mechanics don't really pan out or get fleshed out as much as they should be. Same with the story. And it has some frustrating elements, But this, unlike Outsiders, it doesn't feel like a fully fleshed out game. It very much feels like a prologue for something much bigger and grander in design. But I'm really looking, and it's a lot more, I will say, unlike Outsiders, which really threw me for a loop. I didn't know what was going on with it, and it had a great build up and payoff. The toy shop was a lot more predictable in terms of storytelling. I could predict what was probably going to happen around the corner more often and more likely. But not with that being said, it's still a really good build up with a really good payoff, and I hope it sort of is left on a to be continued. I hope this gets made into a larger game. I really hope the universe in this story gets expanded upon, because I think it really needs it. And anything past that point, it's not as scary as well. I may as well point this out. It's not as scary as Outsiders. Outsiders I couldn't even finish. I played a few rounds and then just looked up a walkthrough on YouTube because honestly I couldn't handle the stress of it. I was able to get through the toy shop. I don't want to spoil anything though. This is very much one you want to just play. Go in blind. Go in blind. Much like Outsiders, go in blind on this one. It's worth it. Solid title. Looking forward to the developers' other works. Definitely in the top range of the B tier list, without question. And now we are finally off the T sections. Let me check my listings. Oh wait, no. There's one more. I almost forgot. How could I forget Touched by an Outer God? This is a first-person roguelike shooter in which you play as a character who has to eat portions of cosmic beings in order to upgrade yourself and move through these arenas in order to find out or save your father. This one is really, really good. It's not as scary as some of the other games in this list, but it's a lot of, and it is somewhat repetitive, but it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. It's a very, at first it plays itself almost up comedically, but then gradually becomes more, it tells a very tragic tale in the long run. Although the ending is a little too abrupt for my liking. I will say that I think the ending is a little too abrupt, but not counting that, I'm actually going to say that I'm going to put it ahead of the toy shop, mostly because of the mechanics on display. Mechanically, it starts off very simple, and then once you get a hold of the cosmic powers, it gradually develops into something very, very cool. And I love how as you progress, enemies are a little bullet spongy, which is a bit of a shame, but I love the sense of progression in terms of as you're upgrading, your body begins to change, and you can see the changes on your hands, on your arms, as you sort of go through section by section. And that's also displayed in the storytelling elements as well, and I love the payoff. The ending is way too abrupt, but the section right before the ending is a great, great payoff. And I loved that section of it. I think the toy shop has a better story, but the problem is that it's also incomplete, whereas Touched by an Outer God feels like a very fully fleshed out plot with a beginning, middle, and end. And on top of that, mechanically, the toy shop has a lot more variety going for it, but I think the mechanics are a lot better designed and are more tightly designed and Touched by an Outer God as opposed to the toy shop. Whereas the toy shop tries to do a lot of different things, but the execution can sometimes lack and be frustrating. Touched by an Outer God is more repetitive, not as much variety, but the mechanics are sound. They are on point. They're satisfying to use. The enemies are a lot of fun to fight. Even though they're a little bullet spongy, they're a lot of fun to fight because you can never quite predict how they're going to react to your attacks. Sometimes you'll even jump across, chasms, and they will just wait there. They know, it's almost as though they're designed in such a way to where it kind of makes sense, where they know that if they follow you, you can just sort of shoot from the chasm that you jumped across, and the moment you jump back, they're right on top of you again. They're very hard to predict, and it's almost as if they're designed in such a way where it's like a game of tag, or a game of like chess, where every move that you make, you have to counteract whatever move they respond with in terms of their movements. Their attack patterns are pretty typical, but their movement patterns are very sporadic. And that gives a sense of intellect in terms of how you fight them. Like, it gives the enemies the impression that they're a lot more intelligent than they may actually be. And that was a really cool experience, especially with the... There's an ending boss fight in particular that's really cool in terms of how it's designed, that was very, very tense. That I mean, I loved. I thought the ending boss, while a little bullet spongy, was really well designed. I really loved this one as its own little experience. Whatever the development team makes from this point forward, I am absolutely looking forward to. And that leaves us off with the last game. Yeah, the last game, Undiscovered. This is from, if I remember correctly, let me check over the listings again real quick. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's from the same developers as Don't Go Out, I think. I think Don't Go Out. Not any of the other devs. Yeah, I think it was Don't Go Out. Because the Hand of Doom guys are doing their own fully fleshed out version of that game, which is cool. This is a classic Lovecraftian horror tale about a bunch of researchers, archaeologists who go to a location and find out more than they bargained for. And if I'm being perfectly honest, it's a D. It's top of... It's not top of the D. It's almost top of the D. This game has sort of an interesting camera mechanic where you play as the wife of the head archaeologist, following him with sort of a crank camera. It has a decent visual design, but quite frankly, it's not until the second half of the game where it gets really cool. It's a minimalist game where you basically just explore a location, but it's a little frustrating because, one, your movement speed is ridiculously slow. It's a little finicky. The game's overall technical performance in terms of frame rate is all over the place. Sometimes the camera, the main element of the gameplay, can actively get in the way of enjoying it, and on top of that, it's somewhat inconsistent. Sometimes the camera will just clip right through the whole level geometry. Other times, it doesn't actually make sense how the camera person is following you, so to speak, because there are elements of the game where you have to walk across certain chasms or areas that the camera person should not be able to follow you through. So there's also some story inconsistencies for the sake of convenience. And then on top of that, there are enemy scripted events with enemies, and enemies that, quite frankly, don't pose any real threat. They're really terrifying when you first see them, but then you realize you can just walk right around them as if they're nothing. So there's not much of a sense of danger. There's a great sense of tension, but not much of a sense of danger until the second half. This is sort of one of those games where the payoff is worth it, despite it being really finicky. And much like the thing in the lake, I might eventually upgrade it to C tier in the long run, even though I don't really love it, simply because the second half of the game, the crescendo, the finale, is really cool. It recontextualizes the gameplay and the perspective a bit in a way that feels appropriate, and it functions better than the first half in terms of how you control the camera and how it, natural it feels to control the camera movements and everything. And it adds to the tension. Whereas in the first half of the game, the camera orientation and how that ties in with the mechanics is somewhat frustrating at times. Whereas in the second half, especially with how the story ends off, I feel like it's overall better handled. I love how it plays out almost like a silent film too, where it takes place like during the 1920s, where the government has sort of found this tape, and you're just watching over the tape, so everything is silent. You're just reading subtitles. So I like the aesthetic. Aesthetic, and I like the story. It's a solid little Lovecraftian story. I just didn't care for the gameplay too much. I felt like the gameplay was somewhat lacking up until that second half where I feel like the overall execution of what they were going for was much stronger than the first half. So yeah, and that's pretty much it for my listings so far. So yeah, F tier is still Another Late Night and Rotgut. D tier is the thing. Top of the D tier is The Thing in the Lake and Undiscovered. The pay is nice would have been a C if not for the fact that some horror elements feel a little inconsistent. The camera's a bit inconsistent, and then on top of that, it feels way too short. And I don't think at this point it's going to ever get an expansion because I think the developer went on to move to Bethesda Game Studios. So he got a career upgrade, to say the least. And then Carthank is bottom of the D tier just because it's frustrating. C tier, To the End of Days, is good but frustrating. Mr. Bucket told me to, I still really like, just for the writing. Hand of Doom is easily best of the C tier. B tier, I would say Arcadeltra. I'm not going to list all of them off, but Arcadeltra is my least favorite. Too reliant on jump scares and a little too minimalistic and repetitive, but despite that, it's still really effective with a solid story to boot. Squirrel Stapler is the best. Solid horror and really solid and well fleshed out mechanics for the most part. And then A tier is the Mansion metagame, Charlotte's Exile, the Diving Bell. Probably Outsiders is still Outsiders and Shatter from DreadX Collection 1 overall are still better than the top games in the A tier for DreadX Collection 2, but DreadX Collection 2, by comparison, as this listing should show, at least in my opinion, overall doesn't just bring the quantity, it brings the quality with the quantity. Even some of the games I don't enjoy in DreadX Collection 2 are still better than some of the weaker games from DreadX Collection 1. And I'm very much looking forward to playing the third collection and making another tier list for that one and just adding on to this. And, I mean, overall, I still just love the idea behind this collection, and I hope more developers, I hope they keep making these. I really do. And I hope more developers take inspiration from this to put their own unique spins on this type of stuff, because it's awesome. And the next one coming up is going to be Spoopy. So, spooky and cute is the mixture. And that's going to include a whole catalog of games, a lot of them. So, that'll be interesting to do a tier list for as well. I might do some playthroughs of them. We'll see.